Already covered a lot of territory today. We've actually gone more than 2,000 years, but we still have some stamina, so we'll continue to get closer to our own particular period. And now we're entering the 1900s. And one thing that has been going on in the 1900s, the 20th century, is that people have noticed the importance of social and cultural circumstances for communication. And so there are several, I call them socio-cultural traditions. And I'm going to talk about three. One is a British tradition, where you combine mostly anthropology and linguistics. Then an American tradition, which is more centered on sociology, pedagogy, education. And then there's going to be a Russian tradition. So that's Russian activity theory. But we'll talk a little more slowly about each of them. Let's start with the British tradition. The British tradition, interestingly enough, starts with a non-English person. Bronislaw Malinowski. Anybody here from Poland? Nope. He was a Polish nobleman who, for some reason, got stranded in the First World War on a South Sea island. And on this island, he made a lot of observations on culture and language. And he observed the importance of communication and language for different cultural patterns. He wrote a very famous essay, and a book, also several books, but especially one famous essay where he described the role of language in communication for going fishing. And this essay was part of a famous book which was published in 1922, The Meaning of Meaning, and it was an appendix to that book. And you could say it's like one of the first real exercises in pragmatic linguistic analysis. The use of language and what the use of language can, the benefits of the use of language and the non-benefits, things go wrong, etc. So he was very important, very influential. Many people read him. I'm not going to go into so many details now. I'm going to tell you that he was not a linguist, he was an anthropologist, but he looked a lot at the role of language for social structure and for culture. Okay. The second person here I'm going to talk about is this guy. What does he look like?
Archaeologist.
Archaeologist, not bad, not bad. Do you know where he is?
No.
Egypt, maybe?
In Egypt, exactly. That's where he is. This is a typical old-fashioned British way of dressing in these sun helmets. He's in Egypt. Actually, he's a special kind of archaeologist. He's an Egyptologist. Yeah. But he's not interested in modern Egypt, he's interested in old Egypt, right? And you can see that when he lived, 1879 to 1963. So he did a lot of analyses of hieroglyphs and how to read them and decipher them and so on. And in doing this, he discovered that you could not really do this unless you had a theory about what they were used for. So now we get back to pragmatics and language use. Okay, he became so interested in this, and he thought that language use was like the fundamental basis of linguistics. So again, you can see he's writing at the same time as Ferdinand de Saussure, who has this distinction between langue et parole. Gardner thinks almost the opposite. You should not make this kind of distinction. You should start from language use, and that's where you're not. So he wrote a book which was published, I think, in early 30s, 1932 or something, where he presented his very pragmatic language theory. It's one of the first sort of totally pragmatic language theories presented. Alan Gardner. He became, the English liked him so much that he was knighted. Actually, he should be called Sir Alan Gardner. Yeah. Okay, the third person here is a guy, as you see, John Rupert Firth. He was a civil servant in the British Empire. He was working in what is now called Myanmar, or perhaps again called Burma sometimes. In those days it was called Burma. And he was, you know, and Burma is one of these countries, we don't have anyone from Burma here? No. It's one of these countries where you have a lot of languages in the country. And he was interested, as many British people were, in trying to describe the linguistic variety of wherever they were. And he was doing this. And in doing this, he noticed, like Malinowski, I mean, they are, you know, he is first. This one is second. This one is third in time, in writing, and so on. So he is probably somewhat aware of these two. Perhaps, I don't know. Anyway, about Malinowski, because Malinowski became very famous. So he starts to write about, again, culture and language, how they go together. How you can never, according to him, study language without taking the cultural context into account. And again, British people like this a lot. So he was made the first professor in England of general linguistics. This happened, I think it was in 1947. We had this, you like 1947, right?
Yeah.
Maybe this is another reason, like 1947. That's when he became professor. I think he was also knighted. So both this guy and this guy, him I don't think they knighted him. Okay, so these were all stressing the fact that we could not really analyze language and communication without also putting it into a cultural context. So anthropology is very important for these people. Connection between linguistics and anthropology. Okay, there is a lot more to be said about all of these, but this is a survey course where we can only give you small glimpses from different people. So let me now go across the Atlantic and go to the United States. And again, there are lots of names there. I'll just mention two names. One name is George Herbert Mead, and he was professor of sociology. Sociology, so now you notice we're going from linguistics and anthropology to sociology. He was working in the University of Chicago, which was a center for a lot of this work, like the guy Charles Morris, who came up with the term syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. He was also working at the University of Chicago. And, well, he founded a school of sociology which still exists today, and there are people who say that they are symbolic interactionists. That means that he thinks that social processes, well, what is symbolic interaction? It's mostly language, it's talking to each other. I mean, it could be other things also, but language is maybe the most important part of it. And so he says social structure is in general built through interaction with symbols. He's putting very strong light on the role of language, which has remained an important ingredient in especially American sociology, but also in other kinds of sociology. One very famous analysis that he took actually from a social psychologist called Cooley, and the idea was, how can we understand how small children become full-fledged members of society? The idea is that small children, as they grow up, start to imitate other people and start to understand how other people want them to react. He called this process taking the role of the other. So it means that small children are learning to see themselves as other people are seeing them. Okay. Or maybe to be more careful, they're learning to see themselves as they think other people are seeing them. Okay? So that's taking the role of the other, trying to see yourself from the outside in some sense. And in doing this, he makes a distinction between the biological ego and the social ego. And he calls these two, the biological ego is the I, and the social ego is the me. And the social ego is formed then by seeing yourself as others see you. As you can hear, these theories are quite interesting. We don't really have time to go into them more, but I recommend, if you're interested in this, you could read one of his books. So that's George Herbert Mead, generally regarded as one of the most important American sociologists. Was that a knock on the door again? Yeah. Okay, the second person here is not a sociologist, but an education person, pedagogue he would be called in Europe, but in America probably an educationalist. John Dewey. If you speak American English, his name is Dewey. Yeah. If you speak British English, his name is Dewey. Depends on which English you want to speak. I can see the French Canadian smiling. How would you pronounce his name?
Let's not even bother with that.
Right, anyway, he is a kind of disciple of Charles Sanders Peirce. In fact, there's a very strong current in America. A lot of people regard themselves as pragmatists. This guy definitely does. William James is another person, very famous psychologist. I didn't put him on this list because he didn't write that much about communication. But I mean, there is a number of very famous people in American sociology, psychology, etc., that all see themselves as disciples of Charles Sanders Peirce. This guy is one of them. And well, he worked and he wrote a lot of things. And today, when you talk to American people about education, you don't have to wait long before his name comes up. You know, he's one of the leading lights usually. It's like when you talk to psychologists, William James will come up sooner or later. So same way here with John Dewey. And so one of his ideas, he has many ideas, but one of his ideas is that you have lifelong learning. Learning is not something you do just when you're a kid. It goes on the whole life. And here's a quote: "Education is a social process. Education is growth. Education is not preparation for life, but it is life itself." So, you know, we're learning all our life until we die. What do we learn when we die? Yeah, we have to wait and see. It's hard to say.
Also, he's belonged in constructivism.
Yeah. Both of them, you could say. I mean, you know, what social constructivism means is we're going to get to when we get to the Russians, we're going to get even more close to social constructivism. But there are a lot of people who believe in that social things are important in how we understand and constitute our world, right? And these are definitely also in that tradition in some sense. Okay, so now we talked about the British socio-cultural tradition and the American. Let's now go back to Europe and to Russia. Or, perhaps more correctly, not Russia, but the Soviet Union. Yeah, and so we're in the Soviet Union, and this is after the revolution of 1917. And the Bolsheviks are taking over, and you know, everybody has to believe in some sort of Marxism. So there are a number of people in Russia who try to think while still somehow combining it with Marxism. And in fact, this whole school of people, Lev Vygotsky, Alexander Luria, Alexei Leontiev, Mikhail Bakhtin, all of them somehow try to, you know, not go outside of Marxism. Because if they do, bye-bye.
That's why he died young?
What?
That's why he died young? Like 40 years?
Yeah, which one of them? Yeah, they all died. No, Alexander Luria and Alexander Lyon, they didn't die so young. But the two first and the last, yes, they both died because they were actually on the wrong side, so to speak. They're mistrusted. Yeah. But the most famous of these is probably number one, Lev Vygotsky and also Mikhail Bakhtin. And the two in the middle are slightly less famous, but so they were, I put them together. Okay, Lev Vygotsky is basically a psychologist, and he has a lot to say about how children develop, how they develop their thinking, etc. And he stresses again the social aspects of how children develop. And he is often put against Jean Piaget, who stresses the more biological side of human development. So often you see Vygotsky and Piaget as on opposing sides. Piaget is in favor of sort of an inner biological program developing, while Vygotsky is stressing that the way the child develops depends on what social circumstances the child has. Okay, and in doing this, he has a number of concepts which people know about. I put up some of the concepts here. First one is the idea of a pseudo-concept. Pseudo-concept. Okay, this means that when children learn a word, in the beginning they don't really understand what the word means. Let's say that they hear the word daddy. They don't know if daddy means, you know, their daddy, or if it means all males. But, you know, maybe they make a mistake and they say when, let's say the older brother comes or something, and they say daddy, and then mama says, no, not daddy. You know, this is brother. Okay, so the idea is that they pick up these words, and then by using them in context, they gradually fill them with the right content. So it's actually interacting socially with different people gets you to have a more and more precise word meaning, which is like the meanings that other people have for the words. So the beginning here is the idea of a pseudo-concept. They just have the verbal label, they don't really have the content. And if you think about it, I mean, most of the words you have learned, you've not looked up a dictionary and seen what it's supposed to mean. You've just heard the word, right? You've heard it again and again. And when you hear it another time, you begin to understand a little more of the meaning, a little more of the meaning. That's this theory. I think it's good. I think he's right. That's the way it works. Okay. In general, he thinks that when we think, when children learn to think, what they're doing is it's like George Herbert Mead. You can sort of see a similarity here. It's a dialogue within themselves. If you talk George Herbert Mead, could be between the I and the me, between the biological self and the social self. I don't know if Vygotsky would have agreed to that, but he thinks that it's some sort of dialogue going on in your mind all the time. Some people, when they hear that, they say, oh yes, that's the way I think. Some people say, it's not the way I think. I don't know. How many people think that they think in the way of a dialogue? How many people think they don't? I think I do both. Sometimes I think like a dialogue, sometimes I don't. So I think it's one possibility, but I'm not sure it's, we can think in many ways. But he stressed this. He also had some other concepts. The zone of proximal development. That meant that he thinks when we think about what children can learn, we should look at where they are in their stage of development. This is actually getting closer to Piaget in a sense. And you should see what is within the reach of this child right now. How much has the child developed? And what you should teach a child is always something that is just, a little above him, but not so much that you cannot reach. It should always be And this is the zone of proximal development. Proximal means close development. So you should look at, you know, child is now at this stage and can reach this. So that's what you should give them. That's, again, a sort of interesting idea for teaching. And then he has another notion here, which is scaffolding. So you use certain, so the whole idea, you can see this idea of pseudo-concepts. These words become kind of structures that can be filled gradually. So Vygotsky is looking for help tools that can help you to develop. Those are the scaffolds. Like when you build a house, scaffold means the structure of a house, you know what it means? So it helps you to put up the house. Same way here. So he's become very popular. He became very popular in America. And actually it was through being made popular in America that he was then made popular in the rest of the world. It didn't really come directly from Russia. And it came long after his death. I remember when I ran into him the first time, which is about 40 years ago, he was not at all popular. And you know, it was like very few people had ever heard of him. I was one of the first people to read a little by Vygotsky at that time. Now he's one of the most common people to talk about, at least in Swedish education circles. Okay. He was part of some other people who were trying to develop a more general theory of how human activities develop sort of as children developed into adults, and how we develop from doing individual actions into social actions, and the foundations of this in our brain and in our behavior. And these other guys here, Alexander Luria is the big Russian theorist on how the brain works, on brain functions. He's been very, very important also in for some schools of Western thinking about brain physiology. While Leontiev is more generally interested in, let's say, behavior. I think the Russian word is deятельность. Deятельность. Yeah, okay. Deятельность. Okay. Good. And then we have the last one here is Mikhail Bakhtin. And he was doing many things, but his big claim to fame is probably in literary analysis. So he wrote some very famous books about Dostoevsky, and also but also he thought a lot about what dialogue is all about. And in fact, one of his favorite ideas is that all of science, in a sense, is kind of dialogue. We're talking. Bakhtin doesn't really think that there's an end to the whole thing. It's a continuous conversation between different scientists. And he gives this picture of how dialogue is a very good way to think of development of science and literature, and also of, let's say, what happens within the literary work. And he has some other concepts. One is polyphony. So when you read a literary work, and let's say you have Dostoevsky, and he has several characters who are talking to each other. So the author has to think about what is the personality of this character, what is the personality of this character, and when they speak to each other, he has to do it from within the personality of these people. But at the same time, he cannot escape himself. He is still the author himself. That means that when you're reading a work, you always get many voices. Okay, that's polyphony. So that's also a type of music, choir music, where you have several voices mixing. But Bakhtin had the idea that that's the way we should also look at a book. So the author's voice is there underneath, but then you have the characters talking to each other on top of that. So many voices are being mixed to each other. And then his last word here is heteroglossia. That means that not only can you see this kind of influence within the book, you can also see it between books. So there are lots of, later on in Western literature, this was called intertextuality. So you find texts of another piece, of, another author. So for example, I don't know, you have Dostoevsky writing, maybe if you look at Tolstoy, there will be something from Dostoevsky, etc. like that. That's finding another. Hetero means another, like glossia. So you find bits of different languages or different writings mixed with each other. Okay. So that, you can see the Russian tradition is a little different. The British socio-cultural tradition is more on anthropology and other parts of the world where the British Empire was present and people could go and travel. The American is more, let's say, sociology and teaching, more practical. And the Russian is, I don't know how to characterize it, it's psychology combined with literary analysis. It's a little different. So all three have their own characters. And all three are very much discussed still today. But none of these are totally outdated. They are still there on the agenda. Okay.
Let me ask you.
Yeah?
Like, are we supposed to memorize all of these?
Yes. That was a short and clear answer, right?
Yes.
So, better start tonight. And, if you know the people who write about communication theory, they know about these guys. And I'm not giving you more than 50 names here.
That's nothing.
That's nothing. I mean, if you're a Muslim, you have 100 names for God, right? Okay, so to start this process, I take this little. Try to find a communication-related research question that can build on one or more of the theories in the British, American, or Russian social-cultural tradition. Now, discuss this amongst yourself for a few minutes. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot more people around who have been doing things. So, Stefano here was complaining, where are the Italians? Croce, Gramsci, where are they? They're not on these slides. Okay. Any examples of research problems? Yes?
Like, we were just wondering, like, talking about scaffolding.
Yes.
And this zone of proximal development.
Yes.
How do you measure that zone, and how do you evaluate what would be the next step in the process of learning?
Yeah, very good question. That's not at all easy. So you would have to, how would you go about to, did you hear what he said? How do you actually make these notions of zone of proximal development a little more precise and exact? If you take a particular child and you ask about this child right now, what is the zone of proximal development?
Right.
How would you go about, how would you do that?
Well, we, based on discussion, we agreed that the teacher would be like a sort of scaffold, and based on what this teacher knows about the child, it will find a way, for example, combine. The teacher will find another child who knows more and will put them in a team, so that child will teach the other child.
Okay, this would have a presupposition that the two children are similar.
And what one child knows more than the other.
Yeah, but if they were very different, that might not be.
Yeah.
But that would be one way. That would be a practical solution. What about it? You have to think about it more theoretically. You don't have to solve this now, but I think it's a good example of a question that could be, come out of, for example, the Russian tradition. How about, anybody thought about the British? You don't remember what the traditions were. Let's have a look. Did anyone have a question for the British tradition? Yeah?
Well, we were kind of talking about, and I was wondering about comparing the analyses of hieroglyphs to pseudo-concept learning.
You mean the actually archaeologists are treating the hieroglyphs as a kind of pseudo-concept?
Yes.
Yes, very good. I like that.
Yeah. I thought that was
That's
interesting,
great.
but I didn't have a specific question yet.
That's a very good. What if you were treating the archaeologist's analysis of the hieroglyphs as you would treat the
Yeah.
child who was learning? That's a great idea. I like that. Yeah, very good, very good. And now you're actually not just doing the British; you're crossing the Russian and the British. Good. Anything else? Stunning silence. If you just say something, I can help you to develop it. Yeah?
We were talking about how maybe using the British anthropologist ground, you could decrease the making of othering in between cultures.
They'd like you to treat the others as a kind of strange.
Yeah, maybe with contemporary issues when it comes to certain prejudice concerning different cultures
Yeah.
and religions.
Yes.
How we can use communication to decrease that othering making in
Yes.
society.
Very good. That's also a strong practical side. How we can, all interaction between people who have prejudice against each other does not always lead to less prejudice. Sometimes it leads to more prejudice. So one of the big questions is, how can we have interaction between two groups that have prejudice against each other to be of such a quality that the prejudice decreases? That's actually a very difficult question and a very important question. If you think about the many places in the world where we have conflicts, there you have groups who nearly always have strong prejudices against each other. How can we decrease that? Very important. Important question, not easy to solve. And maybe some of these guys could help us in some ways, I agree. Yeah? Nobody, how about the Americans? Actually, I forgot to say one thing about by Don Dewey. What he's most famous for is learning by doing. So you should not just teach people theoretical things. You should do things. That's why I'm asking you to try to put into practice what I'm telling you about. Okay? That's learning by doing. So that was Dewey's main idea, that you should always do something with what you're learning. It's not enough just to read on it or just have some abstract concepts. I'm sure most of you have heard about this, learning by doing, have you? Yeah, it's quite well known. Okay, you don't have to do this now, but it will, this will be something that will come back to you. Okay, I now want to continue. I told you Michael Halliday, he's one of the people in the 1900s. He's born in 1925, he's still alive. He emigrated from Britain to Australia, and he is, as I said, still alive there. And he is teaching, or he developed a theory of functional systemic grammar, which has been quite widely used, especially in Australia and in the countries around Australia. Not so much in Europe and America, less. And part of this theory, or a development out of the theory, is he also wrote on something he called social semiotics. And in this, he develops theory of different language functions. You'll find this in many linguistic theories, that people try to think of what are the fundamental functions of language. You remember in Aristotle, the three functions when you give a talk: logos, ethos, pathos. So this is another take on the same kind of idea. And Halliday says that language has an ideational function. You can share ideas, or transfer, we'll come to that. It has an interpersonal function, and it has a textual function. And this kind of linguistics has been a kind of basis for a development of multimodal communication theory. Multimodal communication means that when they it can actually mean many different things, but here it means that you combine analysis of picture and texts, especially in school books. And there have been some people who have been students of Halliday, Günther Kress, Theo von Leeuwen, and they have written books where they try to develop Halliday's ideas into an analysis of how you can combine picture and texts, especially, as I said, in educational material. Has anybody of you read any of those books? No. You have?
In my education degree.
Yeah. Which one did you? Who did you read?
I shouldn't even raise my hand.
No. Okay. That was one of those guys. Yeah. Yeah. They are popular with educationalists. Yeah. And as I said, you will see later that actually there are two very different traditions for how to study multimodal communication. This is one of them. This tradition is more focused on, yeah, as I said, picture, text. The other one is focused on face-to-face communication, using gestures and what happens when you stand in front of another person and you communicate. That's a different tradition than this. So, I'm wondering if I should do one more tradition. Or maybe you need a little break? Or yes, a little break? No. 10 minutes. Getting to something, I mean, what we just talked about was more inspired by the social sciences, anthropology, sociology, etc. This is more inspired by philosophy. And it's, let's say, very German in its origin. And we have a lot of people in communication theory who like to call themselves phenomenological. Okay, that's one of the buzzwords. And, okay, that word can mean many things. It has a long history, actually, in German philosophical thinking. It means one thing in the philosopher Immanuel Kant, it means another thing in the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Hegel, and it means a third thing in the guy we have up here.
Sorry.
Okay, so I just want to warn you, that word can mean many things, but when it's used in communication theory, it usually means this guy's stuff. Okay, and to understand this word phenomenology, we should realize that phenomena are things that we experience. Actually, that's a common meaning to Kant, Hegel, and Husserl. But what Husserl did was that he took a more, let's say, psychological approach. He wanted to examine the contents of his own thinking as closely as possible. The phenomena that he experiences. And a very careful description of your own thinking, of your own, as Husserl would have said, mental acts. That's what he called phenomenology. And he wrote several books where he outlined the structure of the mental act, the structure of thinking. This was very influential. Many people read this and became influenced by it. And you, still today, a lot of people say they have a phenomenological background. Okay, let me talk about, I won't talk so much about his philosophy because it's not, in a sense, not so directly related to communication. He does say a number of things about language, but it's more in the sort of semiotic, fairly non-communicative sense, where you regard language as a system, but you don't never really think very much about communication. But there were several people who were his students, so to speak. One of them is called Alfred, or was called Alfred Schultz when he lived in Germany, Austria. But he moved to the United States, and in the United States he dropped the two dots over the U, and he dropped the L. And he became Alfred Schultz. And he wrote, on a phenomenological basis, on the concept of relevance. He's one of the first theories of relevance in communication. What does it mean to be relevant? What is relevant to say when you speak to another person? That has later become a very big tradition. So relevance theory, as we'll probably come back to later, is today one of the big traditions. But one of the first people to speak about this and to analyze it was this guy. And his book is called Reflections on Social Relevance or something like that. And it's from 1930s or 1940s. I don't remember exactly. Okay. Another person who was actually a student of Husserl's, well, not student, actually he became a kind of student, or he had read Husserl's work, and he was very, in writing his doctoral thesis, he was very influenced by what Husserl had written. Martin Heidegger, regarded as one of the, together with Husserl, one of the greatest German philosophers of the 1900s. Again, Heidegger is not really so much interested in communication, but he's very interested in language. And he's all the time talking about what language, how language works, and what you can get out of different analysis of word meanings and so on. Let me just take one example. He's deeply convinced that the most important question in philosophy, does anyone know what the most important question in philosophy is? Anybody from Germany here? No. Okay. According to Heidegger, the most important question in philosophy is die Seinsfrage. That the question of being. And what is the question of being? The question of being is this: why is there anything at all? Why is there anything? Why does anything at all exist? That's the most important question. Why does anything exist? And you might say that is a fairly important philosophical question. Okay, and then when you follow Heidegger, he has a big word called Sein und Zeit, which means being and time. And you see how he analyzes this problem. Well, again, he uses linguistic analysis. So he says, what does existence mean? He says, well, maybe we can get some idea of what it means if we look at Old Greek. And then he says, existere. And then he says, this means, I'm not sure he's right, but he says, this means to stand out. Maybe it's Latin. Is existere Latin?
Yes.
It must be Latin. It's not Greek. It sounds Latin. So it's X is out and sister. Okay, so stand out. Okay, so that means somehow existence becomes, if you think about what is to stand out, it becomes noticeable. So therefore, existence and standing out, being noticeable, are somehow related, and on it goes like this. Okay, this is he is very much influenced by what I would call etymological analysis. That is the analysis of the word meanings as they originally appear in old texts. And he tries to use that for his analysis. Okay, a lot of people claim that they have this kind of philosophy as a background for what they're doing. Here, this guy, Martin Buber, he actually talks more about communication. And he pictures, well, he thinks about communication in religious terms. So he writes a lot about dialogue as a relation between I and you, I and thou. And who is thou?
God.
God, that's it. It's between me and God. And the gulf between me and God, and how it can be overcome, and what the consequences are for ethics. Okay, so when you think about, so one big topic is communication ethics. How should we communicate in an ethical way? And a lot of people find inspiration in the works of Martin Buber for this. Okay, another name I have on this list is Hans-Georg Gadamer. He doesn't have a picture. He has written a lot and thought a lot about interpretation. So, you know, when we write something or when we talk, there are always two sides. There is writing and there is reading. There is speaking and there is listening. So the other side, the interpreting side, can also be systematically studied. And hermeneutics is actually an old word for that, for studying what things mean and how you can come to a reasonable understanding of what an old text, for example, means. This word was originally coined in relation to studying old texts that are hard to understand. Okay, but you can also use it, of course, about understanding in general, in dialogues, in texts that we're reading now. And so he has written a lot about that, and that's been a strong tradition, let's say, especially in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there was a strong debate about hermeneutics and how one should, what theory would be the best theory to understand what understanding is. To understand what understanding and interpretation is. Last on this list, I have put phenomenography, which is a tradition that actually has had some role here in Gothenburg, because there was one person here who was professor, he's still alive, of education, and he thought that educationalists had been not sufficiently interested in the subject matter that was being taught and how children understood it. So this is in line, in a sense, with the Vygotskian idea of trying to understand how children would think of what you're saying. So he wanted people in education to study much more closely the structure of the content that was being taught and how children actually understood what was being taught. So there are many famous studies that they have made in this tradition. One is a study of the concept of force. You know the physical formula F equals m times A? Anybody knows this? F equals m times A. You never done natural science? Force equals mass times acceleration? Nope. Okay. You're all humanists. You don't know. Okay. Anyway, it turns out that children understand this in very different ways. They don't really have a vague understanding of what force means here. And so they made a lot of studies about how children could get a more precise understanding of what physical force really is. Okay. And he called this approach phenomenography. Graphy was to make it more descriptive. Logy here, phenomenology would be like a theory, and he would have more of a descriptive approach to the contents of thinking around different things that we teach in school. His name is Ferenc Marton. He is nowadays employed at the University of Hong Kong, where he teaches. Anybody from Hong Kong here? No.
How old is he?
Close to 80? Close to 80, yeah. I think so. You know, in China, they have respect for older people. That's a good thing about China. Yeah. Okay. I'm thinking that maybe maybe I'll give you a chance to think about this one too. Think if you can think of any problem, talk to your neighbors, and I'll go back so you can see the picture. See? Okay? Do you have any suggestions? You can make a half-baked society. Yeah, come on.
How Martin Buber,
yes,
assumption of the dialogue between I and those, so God,
Yes.
is different in different religious contexts.
Very good. I like your suggestions. That's good. So we would have, you would compare, let's say, a dialogue between a Christian and God, a Muslim and God.
Yeah,
And I don't know what other religions have God.
maybe
They,
also polytheistic
Jews,
religions.
yeah, or polytheistic. You talk to many gods.
Yeah.
that would go with Bhaktin polyphony. Yeah, good idea. Why don't you write a paper on that? That's actually, I've never seen anybody write on that. That's good.
I'll write it down.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, anything else? You don't have to have it finished. As I said, I can help you to imagine what it could be. Yeah.
We were just discussing how the educational system in Sweden, at least for kids, is based on the presupposition that we understand things in like the right, more or less the same way, and that maybe it could be, if you take more of a hermeneutical approach,
Yeah.
you might be able to allow different methods of teaching for different methods of interpretation,
Yeah.
to make the system more
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. So you would have to then somehow have a classification of different ways of interpreting,
yeah, more or less.
and then you'd have to relate that to different ways of teaching.
Yeah, if it's possible.
Yeah, no, it's possible, but we'll take some theoretical work. You have to think a little about, how can different types of interpretation differ from each other, and how could that be related to a specific way of teaching? Is, for example, learning by doing the right thing for everything? I mean, Dewey probably thought that it's the right thing for everything, but is it? So yeah, that's a good suggestion. Or maybe that's enough. Again, I leave you with this. You'll come back to it and see if you can think of something. Okay, now we come to your favorite, Lord Shannon. Here he is. And Warren Weaver. Okay, this is a completely different cup of tea, as I say. Now we're going from philosophy to engineering. Okay, these guys, this is not philosophy or social science, this is engineering, tele-engineering. Now some of you are happy, you for example. Yes. Yeah, right. Okay, so these guys are impressed by the fact that we can communicate with various artifacts, telephones, computers, etc. In fact, they are mostly impressed because their theory is formulated in the 1940s. Okay? So it's more influenced by tele-engineering, telephone communication, and that sort of communication than it is by digital communication. But they are formulating an abstract theory of communication, you might say, a mathematical theory of communication, which appeared in 1949. And this theory has become very influential, maybe more influential than the other stuff that we have been talking about. But it's also been very much criticized, which we will see later. But in the beginning, nobody criticized. And okay, so it's a mathematical theory, and let's look at some of the ideas. There are two people. The main person here is number one, Claude Shannon. And Warren Weaver actually only cooperated with him for a short time. And Shannon himself continued alone to write more books. And Warren Weaver was writing other things. He wrote on translation and so on. Okay, so they have a model of communication, and they have a definition of information entropy. They don't have a definition of communication, actually. They have a model of communication. Okay, what is information entropy? Well, here we come to the idea that they have is information is basically surprise. If the world was full of just photons and they were all similar, there would be no information. If there's no change, nothing new can happen. Information is something new, something which has surprise value. If everything is as it has been before, there's no information. So the idea is to try to capture the notion of information, which means something new, something surprising. That's the whole idea. Entropy means a stage of, where there are no surprises. It's just the whole world is almost, goes towards the same state. And so whenever we build up structures and differences and so on in the world, that's not entropy. Then we build up information. There will be surprises. Every state is not like every other state. That is information. So you notice this is fairly abstract now, and it's even more abstract when you start to read the mathematical formulas, which I'm not going to show you. Or not much anyway. But maybe you have read the mathematical formulas. No?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. This theory then uses concepts of information source. We'll take a look at the diagram very soon where you can see this. Message, transmitter, and transmitter is typical from telecommunications. Signal, again, sort of typical telecommunications word. Channel, telecommunication. Noise means disturbance of whatever you're trying to transfer to another person.
Noise always exists.
What?
Noise
always exists, yes. Yeah. So you have to say something about what to do with it. Yeah. Receiver, that's the other side. Okay, so you have a sender and a receiver. Information destination, that's where the receiver is. Probability of error. Notice, and now we introduce probability theory. Encoding, decoding, information rate, channel capacity. All these words are given exact definitions, right? And you notice this is different from Martin Buber, dialogue between me and God. This is very, very different cup of tea here. So the notion, communication is a wide field and it has many different approaches. Okay, let's look at a diagram where some of these words will now reappear. So here we have a source. You can take me. I am the lecturer. I'm the source. I'm also the sender. When I speak, that's a message. Then, when I move my speech organs, my lips, my teeth, etc., the air begins to move, and the air moves through up to your ear. So the air between us here is the channel. That's a very bad channel in a sense because it allows everything to come in. You have your ears. You as a person even could be called a receiver, but your ears. And if the communication is successful, the message I am sending is exactly the message you are getting. So there is equality between message over there and message here. If they are the same, successful transfer of information. You don't actually have to do anything, just pick up the message. And where you are is the destination. Okay, there can be problems sometimes, and that is noise. There is a source of noise, and noise can penetrate here, and this could mean that what is being sent is not the same thing as what is being received. Okay? This is the basic idea. You can look at another diagram which so here you have the information source, message, and here they have a concept of transmitter. This really makes most sense in telecommunication, but we can kind of metaphorically use it also for me speaking now. So then transmitter might be my mouth or my gestures with my hands, but actually, it has a more technical meaning in telecommunications. Signal, channel, and again we have the noise here coming in. Received signal on the other side. If you remember, your telephone, well, mobile phones, you have an artifact which picks up the signal and somehow changes it so you can hear it. This is the decoder of the signal, and the destination maybe you can think is you. through the decoder. If you by receiver mean decoder, then maybe it's going to be like this. And other concepts are in here, which are entropy, redundancy, noise, channel capacity. Let's look at one redundancy. What does this concept do here? Does anyone know?
The repeatedness.
Yeah, the more redundancy you have, the easier it is for the message to be transferred, because the noise can then destroy parts of it, but it doesn't make that much difference because the other parts will still survive to the other side. So if you think about the fact that there's always going to be noise, there should always be some redundancy. Otherwise, you know, the communication will not be safe enough. Channel capacity. That means, you know, how much information, what types of information can you send? There is always a limit. You can only send so much, and you know, if you go over that limit, you have to do something to the signal. You might have to cut it up and send it in chunks, and then put the chunks together. So teleengineering is all about how you do things like that. Is that what you've been working with? Coding and decoding and so on. Yeah. Anybody else who's been working with that kind of stuff technical here? Anyway, turn to him. What's your name again? Juan. Turn to him if you want to get more, you know, technical understanding of what's going on here.
And what is entropy?
Huh?
Entropy?
Entropy is this tendency for the world to go to a state of no surprises. Everything is the same, right? It's part of the theory of thermodynamics. And it's one of the principles, maybe the first principle, that everything goes towards total entropy.
I want to say, in face-to-face communication, can we say the language is the transmitter? Like if we don't know the same language, I can't be decoding it.
No, that's a problem, yeah?
Yeah, I think in face-to-face communication, the language comes to the transmitter part.
Yeah. I mean, what these words are supposed to mean in face-to-face communication is somewhat up for grabs, right? They're slightly metaphorical here. When they are removed from telecommunication, you still have to guess a little about what the words mean. I mean, you suggest language, I suggest the mouth. But both could be put in that category, I suppose, yes. They are part of the tools that have to be used in order to get the signal going. Yeah, you could think that way. Okay, so this, as I want to stress again, this model has been very important. A lot of people believe in this. They believe it's correct and good. Most exact. It probably is the most exact theory of communication that we've had so far. I mean, still today. There's really no more mathematically precise theory than this. But, as I said, it's been criticized. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't learn it. You should learn parts of it, at least, you know, the main ideas. Okay, so here is the question. Try to find some point in Shannon and Weaver's theory that can be criticized. Okay? Anybody has any criticism? Yes?
I would say, on the one hand, you have the sender and the receiver, but you can criticize that not one person is at a time the sender, but also that they are co-communicating, so that it's not just one person who is sending the whole time, I would say.
So when you and I are talking now,
yeah.
When I'm talking, I see how you react. So information from you is going simultaneously to me sending this as I'm talking. I see how you react in your face. Yes?
Yeah.
That's not part of this model at all. Here you have, you know, I send something, you receive it, you send back. So that simultaneous transmission in both directions, which is a very, you know, strong characteristic of face-to-face communication, is not here. That's exactly one of the things that can be criticized with this model. Very good. Anything else? Yeah?
We talked about how the possibility of not misinterpretation based on the message that's being sent, but how when you receive the message, your personal bias that could affect how you receive the message.
Yes. That's the other thing that has been very much criticized. The recipient is made totally passive here. Has no active role at all. And success in communication is identity with the information I'm sending, if it's identical with the information you're picking up, successful communication. But that's not really how communication works. Interpretation is an active process, and you never have exactly the same thing. What actually turns out to be a more reasonable way of thinking of successful communication is if the thing we're going for together can be continued in the same direction, it's successful. Exact identity never occurs, really. And one of the reasons for that is that the receiver is always active. You can be listening to me now and thinking, oh, isn't he going to stop soon so we can go to our entertainment? Or you can be thinking about something else. So you filter out part of what I'm saying. That's not really part of this model at all. So that's right. Those are two important theoretical points. Maybe the two most important. There are others too. But let me leave that now. Okay. Shannon and Weaver's mathematical theory of communication is related, or can be related, to other approaches to communication. And that's, I think, the last slide that I can show you today. And that's the cybernetics and systems tradition. Very important in the United States. A lot of people have been inspired by this. Maybe the first name on this list is Norbert Wiener. He was a child prodigy. You know what a child prodigy is? Who knows? German word for this is Wunderkind. Swedish word for this is Underbarn. Doesn't help those of you who don't speak Swedish or German. It means a person, like Mozart, you know, he could write the symphonies or whatever he wrote when he was 7 years old. So this guy, he could do things, very skillful things when he was very young. Norbert Wiener. Okay, he was the founder of something called cybernetics, the art of, you could say, mechanical control systems. So how can we, okay, and one of the big notions that he invented was the notion of feedback. So most of you have been in a house with central heating, and you've heard about the thermostat, perhaps. Thermostat is a kind of thermometer which is in the room, and it sends signals down to the central heating. If you want your house to be, let's say, 20 degrees warm in the winter, when the temperature is going down below 20, the thermostat picks up, senses it's now below 20, and it sends a signal down to the heater, more heat coming up. Okay, this is called feedback. So picking up information, and the heater starts to go, and maybe then the thermostat says it should not be more than 20 degrees. So the heater is going, bop, and suddenly we have 22 degrees, and then the thermostat up here sends a signal, stop heating, you're already above the goal, right? So that process of sending, you do an action, and the effects of the action are reported back to the person or the thing that is doing the action, that's feedback. Okay, and he invented that notion, and it's been extremely
like teacher and student.
Huh?
Like
also, yes. So when I'm asking you to think about these theories, and you put up your hand, I'm getting feedback. To what extent did you actually understand the theory? That's okay. So feedback is a wide notion, can be used in many different ways, and it's a very important notion in communication theory. One of the people who used it in communication theory was Gregory Bateson. Here he is, together with his wife at that time, Margaret Mead, who was a professor of anthropology. They are together on Bali. Here they are, out in the jungle somewhere, 1930s. Okay. I don't really have time to say much more about him, but he came up with a lot of interesting, actually it's a sort of application of Wiener's ideas to communication. But you will get, I think, some more special lectures on this from Mikael Jensen, because he likes this very much. So you're going to get more information on this. Some people who were very much influenced by Bateson were some psychologists called Paul Watzlawick. I forget what Bevan and Jackson were called their first names. Anyway, they wrote the book called The Pragmatics of Human Communication, which became very influential. So you've heard the word pragmatic several times today, and here you see some psychologists using that notion. This book is from 1970s. Okay. These notions that these people have, Bateson, Wiener, etc., they're also related to something called systems theory. Thinking of many things, societies, but for example the heating system that we just talked about, with the thermostat and the central heating and the sending. This is a system. You can see the whole thing as a system of different components interacting towards a certain goal. In this case, setting a certain temperature that should be kept within the house. That's the goal. And the whole system is working towards that. But you can define many other systems and many other goals. And there's a mathematical theory of systems. General systems theory. Okay, one of the people who has used that a lot to analyze communication is this guy, Everett Rogers. He started by analyzing how farmers in the United States were using different grains. So corn, maize, wheat, etc. And how they were, genetically modifying and selecting the best breeds, and how the best types of grain spread from one state to another in the United States. Okay, so he developed a mathematical theory of that, and that is called the diffusion. Okay, the diffusion of grains. Then, after some years, he realized that this model, the same model, could be used also on communication. For example, to study rumors. When you spread rumors about something, mathematically that can be seen as the same thing as the diffusion of grain. So the diffusion of information in rumor spreading. So he used his mathematical ideas that he had originally from farming. He used on human communication, and he became one of the more important writers on communication in America. Communication since 1947 it's become bigger and bigger subject, and this guy has written very many textbooks and so on, but he's also used this diffusion approach. Okay, then we go to Germany. Here's another guy who used the systems theoretical approach with cybernetics. He was professor in Bielefeld, and he wrote very thick books with lots of words about how you could use cybernetics and systems. But he also analyzed some concepts that were a little less abstract in a sense, although the analysis he gives of them is fairly abstract. So he analyzes love and trust and their role in communication. So if you want to read an abstract analysis of love and trust, you can read Niklas Luhmann. Okay, so he's active in the 1970s, 80s, into the 90s. And the last figure here is Carl Weick. And he's still active, as you can see. He has developed a lot of interesting notions for organizational information theory. So how does communication work within an organization? New ideas. He believes, for example, that a lot of the things that people believe in an organization are actually created by language. If you give something a name, then people start to believe that it actually exists. Do you think this is correct? You talk about something vaguely and nobody knows if it exists, and suddenly you give it a name, and then you start to believe that yes, it's probably something real. he calls this process of how things become real in an organization enactment.
Could you give an example?
What should we take? It's usually something social, which is not so clear. Well, let's say global warming. Some people don't believe in that, right? And there are lots of incidences, and people put them together. When what was his name? The guy who wanted to become president.
Al Gore.
Al Gore, right? When he started to talk about global warming, there were just a lot of different observations, and he made this film, and he went around talking about. And then the more he talked about it, the more people actually believed that there was something like that. And now people believe it's an absolute fact, while there are other people who are still skeptical. They believe that it's a lot of scattered observations, and they don't necessarily go together in one concept. But once that phrase was there, a lot of people. Yeah, that global warming is a fact. We should all, we should do this and this. A lot of programs of sustainable environment are based on the idea of global warming. So anyway, Waite in general believes that this process of labeling something, putting a linguistic label on it, makes it much more thing-like. In abstract terms, it's reification. This is the term used for that. Yeah, he has many other ideas too. But I think that actually, we don't do this now. So that, this topic you can do some other time. Trying to find a communication-related research question that can build on more of the theories in the cybernetic and systems division. So in general, this is the kind of thing we want to, let me say some last words here. Yeah, so the idea is to present you with a number of people who have thought about communication. As you can see, there are many, and there are many more than those that I've covered. And we have now got to about the 1950s. That's where we are. And when I talk to you next time, you will hear even more names and more approaches. And the idea is perhaps not that you should know everything, but you should have heard it at least once, and some of the more important ones you should remember. And when you are writing your own papers, you should know that there is a theory here that could be relevant for what you're doing. And one of the ways to be able to do that is to actually do questions of this type that I'm putting up. Think about these theories and see if you can see some research question that can be related to these theories. That's one way to follow John Dewey's concept, learning by doing. So, when you fall asleep or wake up, think about these theories and see if you come up with a research.